best hair. I just want you to know that before we go live.
So we are live, and welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. And tonight's episode is about the really words weave worlds, and it's about transformational language. So there's only really 3 rules to the show, which is dress for radio, don't be boring, and always remember the rule of 3. So what we're going to try and do today is maybe try and structure the show a little bit, or attempt to, around a few questions for the guests. And really, the first question around language that I came up with, which we can then try and deviate from almost immediately, is how is language changing, and how does that affect the types of worlds that we build?
Well, first of all, let me point out that you just did something with language, which language does, right? It points us into a certain direction. You said, let's give us, a structure, let's have some questions, and immediately directing the conversation and the thought process into a certain direction. So I just want to point that out as a first thing. So language is something extremely powerful.
Yes.
I just would like to also make the preposition that language is actually the end point of a cognition process, right? So on one hand, it's extremely powerful. We all know that. On the other hand, there's a substructure to language. And so language is, to the person who's saying it, is an end point of a cognition process. And I think that is very often overlooked, and perhaps something we can also discuss today.
It's something, Luke, that I would certainly get into in terms of looking at memory, the creation of memory, the lack of management of our memories. Our memories tend to manage us, and language, comes out of memory. And the question that you had, Chris, is how is language changing? We've talked about this. I've spent 30 some years. I used to hire service bureaus. If anyone's old enough, you'll remember service bureaus. And corporations hire service bureaus to watch language, specifically for proprietary sort of liability issues. Who's using my words and my copyrights? I was using it because I was looking at certain words and phrases that I needed to have come into the market, needed to have it to come into consumer consciousness before my work made any sense. So I actually had to wait for language. I had to wait for consciousness. And one of the phrases, for instance, in my model is ask yourself. Ask yourself did not occur in the consumer mind as something that would be said out loud between people until literally right around the time of the Jerry Seinfeld comedy TV show. That's where the phrase ask yourself kind of emerged into the public consciousness. Aha moment. I've waited 37 years for that phrase in 2009. Right around 2009, it clicked. And it clicked, literally clicked, in terms of the readiness for consumer consciousness to embrace the value of that word for each other and themselves.
So what we're saying then is language. It's a bit like a technology; it evolves.
Yeah, we evolve.
And like a technology, it's kind of cutting edge, and then it goes through the cycle. I've forgotten the name of the graph.
The evolution cycle. I think language is changing incredibly quickly, and you don't see it. I think if you look back at television shows 60 years, 50 years ago, kind of when television first came out, you'll see that the language that is spoken relatively recently is a different language to the language we speak now. And you only see the world through your snapshot of what you're currently seeing, and you forget how it's changing around you. It's boiling frog stuff, isn't it? Almost. We are within what we currently see. We're in the world we currently see, but that world is just a tiny snapshot. And that, I don't think that's changed. I think that's existed for a long time. If you look at the kind of language over hundreds, thousands of years, it's different. It changes, it evolves, and it's changing within a lifetime. It's that fast.
And what's accelerating that change?
I think power dynamics. I think language is all about control and power, isn't it? We are evolved as a species because we can manipulate through our communication, and the more sophisticated our communication becomes, the more able we are able to have reach into different countries. If we learn new languages, we can be better consumers, we can trade more easily, we can have broader relationships, we can cross borders. If we have our own language or our own regional accent even, we can have control over other regions within that area. So we can create bias and we can create prejudice and racism. And I think that's the kind of language being so powerful now that we forget that we're playing with it all the time, and sometimes that's negative. And back to Luke's point, it's the end of a cognitive point. So if your inner dialogue is giving you lots of self-limitating language or stories that you're telling yourself about past, future, or present, then the reality is you will use that to then manipulate who you are and what you achieve and what others achieve around you. So it's that infiltration point that's powerful.
I mean, the power thing is, sorry, Dave, go on.
Yeah, I wonder if that's actually, I mean, I agree with some of that framing, but I think it's incomplete, because I think language, you've got Shakespeare, you've got poetry, you've got language that actually inspires, that isn't about mercantile ambition, that is about opening up culture, that's about inspiration. There's Nelson Mandela.
Exactly, but that's all about power and impact and influence.
But I think the point, I'd respond to the point, is that language has been colonized by corporations to serve the purpose and the myth of corporate culture.
I don't know about that. I would perhaps add to that it appears to me, and I might be very wrong, but yeah, communication in the corporate world, in the world of government and governance, is taking more and more space. We all know that the PR departments are growing, so the awareness of the importance of communications is growing. I think that is a shift which is going on everywhere. However, there's another thing which I seem to observe, is this belief that through language we can capture the world in its entire objectivity. And that is way beyond what you're talking about, Dave, which you see the artistic value of language, which doesn't claim to have an objective quality, but a rather subjective expression, how we view, how we perceive the world. But I think that is fading rapidly, the importance of that, whereas it has importance, especially when we talk about cognition, how we perceive the world. We actually perceive the world poetically, but we just try to describe it objectively, and we're drifting into that second area rapidly in the belief this is the actual truth. So this is just a hypothesis, and I'm ready for, just tear it apart if you want to.
I agree with you. I think language is symbolic. And I think, going back to Caroline, I think it's all about really the communication. Language is a tool, and not everybody speaks the same language. So, for example, I grew up in a household where my parents were reluctant to speak English. They wanted to hold on to, the mother tongue, so to speak. So, growing up, for example, in that kind of an environment, the communication and conversations would be through a symbolic framework, a symbolic referencing. So, for example, this would indicate, like a prayer, greeting. But, if you look at it in other cultures, maybe, or in another context, this could mean something else, like an arrest. So for me, I think language is all of that, isn't it? It's the symbolic communication. And it brings me to a point where when I was at my parents' one day, this is a few years ago. So I'm a grown-up adult. I've gone over to my parents, and my dad said to me in the morning, this was on a Sunday morning, he said, make me some tea. Make me some tea, please. I said, okay, Dad, what sort of tea shall I make you? Make me your herbal tea. Herbal. I want your herbal tea. And I'm thinking, why is he calling my tea horrible? So it's language. This is like got that accent that Caroline is saying. But in my mind, I'm thinking, and I had to try and flip his script, or flip the script that I was perceiving, because my dad's lovely. He loves me. Why would he call my tea horrible? But again, I think now we're in that era. I could be completely talking nonsense. I think we're in the era of flipping scripts, especially in corporations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by flipping scripts, are we talking about having a greater awareness of these different angles?
Definitely, because Chris, if you look at what's happening technologically, we are advancing all the time. We're saying we need the bots, we need AI, we need communication, we need conversation. I mean, I could be talking to a chat bot thinking it's a real person, and then after about 30 minutes I realize it's a bloody chat bot.
I just want to put something out there that's probably slightly controversial, but it's for all the businesses that are watching, that are investing in robots to do customer experience. The second that I know it's a robot trying to sell me something or give me a customer experience, I just want you to know that I put the phone down immediately. And I don't care. I have no emotional connection to your robot or your brand or what you are trying to sell me. And so therefore you come off the Christmas list damn quickly when I put that phone down. So we're not fooled by AI and robots, and we think they're sophisticated, but actually they're being programmed by people that, again, haven't necessarily got all of the tools available in terms of what the future looks like and where we need to be, and different regional accents and language and terms. And I think there was a great story of an organisation that had put in a hologram instead of a person, and the sale on the hologram outweighed obviously the person, and so the person got replaced, and the hologram was there as a cheap replacement that was future state. And it could do a lot of things really well, but it hadn't got the basics of where is the toilet as people walked into the council, which is what most people would go in and ask. And so therefore it just raised the number of complaints. There's loads of issues around AI recognising ethnic diversity. And so, you know, we have something that's apparently advanced, but we're still very much on that journey with it, as we are in our own language, as we are in terms of our own personal discovery. And as Luke says, actually what we're trying to do is articulate for ourselves something that is emotive and intuitive and responsive, and turn it into something that's pragmatic and objective. And then we're trying to do that third person into a machine and expect that machine to create the same emotional connection. And in some cases, in my humble belief, it can't.
But it plays back to that, and it can't. Yes, it can't. But it plays back to that symbolic and logical, and what you're describing. You're describing a logical thing on the other side that's talking to you in a logical way and engaging with you on a logical level. But that's not human. It's the symbols, it's the stories, it's the things, it's the deeper stuff. It's system 1, system 2 thinking. It's the stuff at the bottom of your brain where it's all metaphors and symbols and imagery and stories. But I think we're entering a time now when the robots, the AI, are dipping into the symbolic stuff. We're getting into that stuff. We're getting into the feeling stuff. And larger organizations are experimenting a bit with AI and things that sort of play on how we feel, and they measure how we feel, and then they play back, and they're doing things. And you see this with AdNet, which you see with lots of things. So we're getting to a point where the robots are getting to that level, or starting to dip into that level. And I don't know, sorry.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of programming, but in terms of my response to that program as a human, that emotional connection will never be there. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? It's, you know, in Japan, they're quite advanced. So they've got holograms that act as assistants, and for company, they can talk and they can relate and they can speak to the person that's sat in the room. And some people that are very lonely are finding that enormously helpful. You know, we can now turn up to a meeting anywhere in the world, not even as ourselves. And again, that's helpful. But if I'm looking for an opportunity to connect with an organization, then I don't need a robot in order to do that. My preference would still be a human, and long may that continue.
Yeah. Then again, if I want to pay my gas bill, I'm not after an emotional connection. I just want to get it overdone with.
You will be if you've been charged too much, or they've withdrawn from your account. You've got no money left, and it's Christmas.
Yeah,
or
fair
you've
point.
got, that's the reality, isn't it? And so then we only use people for complex tasks or complaints. But then
But
you just say AI.
I suppose going back to what was mentioned, I think, Luke, you were talking about language and power. I suppose as a modern consumer, I want language. I use language almost as a command. I want something. I want instant gratification, and that's how I'm using it to invoke a response, something that I want. My patience, my patience is being eroded and reduced, isn't it? We're being encouraged, to use language in smaller ways, whether it's to do with tweets or whether it's to do with reducing clicks and interaction. We want interaction. We're driving towards, rather than aesthetic ends, we're driving and emotional connections. We're driving language to quite a utilitarian place in some respects.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, on one hand, I think that utilitarian part is working with the chatbots. I have that experience that it is helping me. Yeah, and if I want some information, I'm getting it. I'm fine with that. But in fact, yeah, if I would, I'm sort of aware that this is not a person, so I'm totally okay. I'm just interested in what John said, that now they're playing with this part of the meaning-making process, which is something a little bit different than pure information, and it's difficult to delineate one from the other, but I think let's try and say, okay, one is the information part, one is the meaning-making part, which incorporates all what you said, Chris, in terms of emotions, relationships, history, mythology, symbolism, richness, environment, all that good stuff, which makes people happy. And that's why you see a lot of cat photos on Twitter and Facebook, because it makes people happy to see cat photos, right? There's not much information there, but it gives them something, an experience. And so this experience of language, I'm pretty adamant on that. The experience of language is something different than the pure information which is being relayed by language.
Yeah. So it's very much a multi-dimensional thing, isn't it? I'm just looking in the chat. There's a few interesting things in there, and Andrew Webster's talking about semiotics, signs and signifiers. I'm fairly new to the word semiotics, but he's defined them for me there. The creator has one context and intention, and the perceiver has another. I think that's a very interesting point, isn't it? Particularly as where we're talking about the environment becoming a bit more diverse, that actually there isn't, the hegemony of language is maybe being eroded, isn't it? Or this, using language as a colonial tool.
I wondered if I could just respond a bit about AI, because I have not so much the public facing, but I want the development of AI is mostly being done by tech graduates or scientific people, but they don't have a rounded education and they don't have this language of imagery and myths. What they're doing is reducing human transactions to their most basic components and trying to replicate it. And yes, they're having success, and I'm sure there'll be good that comes out of it. But as this gets more sophisticated, I think we need a deeper understanding of our own humanity to inform where that development goes. Because you can see Facebook is, initially a great concept, a great idea of free sharing. And what it's become now is pretty horrific in terms of the social impact that it exaggerates.
Because it's using what's said on there as a point for control. And, again, when we think about what the data is receiving, it's receiving an awful lot of our data and our information, and then it tries to predict our behaviors and our wants and our needs and our likes and our joys. If we like a cat, suddenly all we see on our Facebook is cats. So the reality is that whilst it is becoming more sophisticated, it's accelerating that with which we can control, because what we're doing is teaching it how to pick up on algorithms that will therefore not only respond to our behaviors, but start to shape them and therefore start to control them. And if you look at what we try to do with language, quite often it's about control. our point around it, and it's not a negative. I don't mean that in a negative way, because it can be like Shakespeare trying to control his audience. He's trying to drive out an emotion. He's trying to get people to think differently about the expression of speech and the beauty of words and the beauty of where that can take you, what that narrative might look like and where that goes in your imagination. So it's not necessarily all negative, but nothing is negative. But it is about saying, well, actually, how are we using language today? So with Chris's point, my need for language is around, I want to be able to instruct. I want something to happen. And so therefore I instruct something and then I become impatient if that doesn't happen, because that's my toolbox. That's what I'm using that language for. Whereas in Luke's scenarios, he might be trying to connect at a much deeper level. And yet we can create a bias around that. So if you put a personality preference of Chris with the personality preference of Luke, you then start to see polar opposites. And what we know about language is that we can better influence if we understand a personality first and we use language to help with that personality and that direction of travel.
Can I jump in, Dave, for a second? I've listened to everyone, and this is very difficult because I'm an American. And as you know, in Europe, we're the loud ones. Speaking of language and communication,
you just need to hold up your mug. That's all you need to do.
Yeah. I don't know if you all saw that. This is my language. This is my whatever mug.
Totally fine.
Symbolic?
I agree.
Is that symbolic or significant?
That is.
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so here we are, guys. I grew up with neurolinguistics kind of in my DNA, and I like to speak to DNA. DNA is my thing, right? I can run a 40-meter dash in 4.6 seconds when I was like John's age. All right. That was it. I mean, I could, and some people couldn't touch it and some people could beat me. So physically, we all understand that about ourselves. And I'm relating this to technology and language. Cognitively, we have neuroplasticity. And you know what? We're going to have organizations and technology that try to affect our neuroplasticity in the future, both for our benefit and also our control.
Yeah.
Facebook, I don't worry about too much. The thing about all the social media is it's all about data that relates to our history, right? It's not data that relates to our revolution. It's data that relates to our evolution as they see it. And it's digital. It's not analog. But we're going to see a shift in technology. And the scariest shift for those that are scared is going to be when they bring an analog chip like the Mythic chip. Just came out. Mythic's been working on the analog chip now for a decade. And it's a 50-layer analog processing chip. And AI has a problem. Robots that run on AI have a problem. Social media that run on AI and ML and DL have a problem. The problem is our brains are analog in terms of that which matters. The prefrontal lobes, the sensory motor cortex, it's the dendrites. It's not the axon. In men, that's what I love about men. Men, the male disposition, let's say, right? We love our lines and our synapses and our zeros and our ones. We love our circuits and our digits. We love digits, digitization. But the digitization movement is going to explode in the next 20 to 30 years. And we're going to see an A to D world come in. Now, when that analog world appears, it's going to be, you have to ask yourself, this is what I've been asking myself since 1984. What is the fundamental motivation of technology and language and everything? What's the fundamental thing that's going on underneath it all? What's moving us to what's moving authenticity? Authenticity didn't exist in the consumer language 7 years ago, guys. I mean, seriously, the word talent, there was no talent officers in organizations 7 to 8 years ago. The word innate and uniqueness did not exist in our consumer lexicon 7, 8, 9 years ago.
So in terms of the exam, the kind of exam question, to again use a framing narrative for power purposes, in terms of how that changes our world, then the fact that those are in our lexicon, presumably, and they weren't, or they're in there to a greater degree, that seems, not quite sure, that seems to point to a certain humanizing of some of this stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, they indicate a vector of the what I call the evolution revolution. I think we're the humanity, the COVID, and the race bias, the issue with people not being able to get along with others because they're different. Okay, all this stuff is happening at the same time. The AI robotic sensor movement is underneath it all, and there's this fear, and there's no fear with people, I believe, that really have a sense of who, what, and why they are. Okay, and their language is a little different. The way they talk's a little different. So I'm not interested in the 0.02%. And guys, we represent, or some of us here represent the 0.02% of the global population. We're a very small piece of the global equation. The 99.98% are just surviving. They're not surviving gloriously. They're just surviving. And I think this is the huge shift we're going through, is the humanization, the evolution of that which makes each individual unique. And in the uniqueness of individuals, the language of uniqueness is what we're seeing. The language of differentiate in meaningful, purposeful, authentic, synergistic connectivity. And by the way, corporations, dysfunctional hierarchies don't like this. They don't want this to happen. They're going to fight it tooth and nail.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes actually what I've found is that people in hierarchies are also interested in this. Actually, that's my experience. It is slightly the converse. I don't know whether it's the organisation I'm in, but actually, what we find is people are people first. That's the great revelation that I've really found through my particular work with guilds and things like that, is really just everybody's a person. It's like, guess what? Oh my word, this person's a person as well, and they're a person normally before they're the language associated with them, whether it's like a language to do with job title or rank or whatever it might be, or function. And that's the interesting thing. And I wonder, actually, with this uniqueness starting to come into our vocabulary, does that mean that it's almost like doing language at school, that rather than me studying French and German, I need to be studying John, Mandy, Dave, Brian, Luke, and Caroline?
Yeah.
Well, there is no self.
Well, maybe
study me.
Yeah. I've started on Brian. I'm starting to get a little bit of an idea. I can't speak fluent Brian, but I'm getting there.
So, Chris, if
we need to speak fluent self. We really need to speak fluent self.
Well, that's another angle. Yeah. So because right. Okay. Brilliant.
I'm interested in posing a question to.
My God, chaos has begun.
So, can I just make a point to Chris? Would that be okay? Thank you for jumping in. You mentioned organizations and hierarchies and how we've got sort of an revolution within folks, and you feel it bubbling. But and you see it a bit in the organizations you're working with. But yeah, I want to. I think it's back to the logical, and it's back to the kind of the deeper brain. I think in organizations, in large organizations, traditionally, they're a kind of a fear-driven kind of thing. And because you've entered fight, flight, or flee, many folks they're doing what needs to be done for themselves. And then they're thinking in the logical, they're not thinking in the emotional. They've left the emotional. They leave the emotional to one side, and they detach from the emotional, and they try and operate totally in the logical, and then they're not thinking necessarily about other people. They're just thinking about themselves, and they're just thinking about what needs to happen. And that doesn't make for evolutionary organizations. But what it does to individuals who are in that state, it causes like a cognitive dissonance, where you're detached from your own self, and you create a sense of imposter syndrome. You create a sense that you're detached from reality, because the human is a combination of two brains. We have this very prehistoric brain that sits at the bottom of our brain. We have the horse, and we've got the rider that's logical on top. And there's people going around in organizations, going around in places, and they're literally trying to operate in the logical, and they're ignoring their emotional needs. They're ignoring what they need beneath the surface. And because of that, their horse is going around trampling everyone, and their logical isn't really acting very logically, because it's basically trampling and the rider's on the floor. Yeah. But it's interesting that organizations, I believe, are and people in organizations, like you said, are starting to realize and see that sort of revolution, that sort of connecting and bringing your whole self to work and working with the others. And I think the point where I said, should I understand each other? I think that is key to it. It's about putting yourself in each other's shoes and going on that journey. But that's not logical. that's bringing your whole self, that's bringing your emotional self. It's that emotional revolution, and we see that in organizations, and I think that is the important thing in the world of work going forwards, and that's the important thing in language and connection. It's what we're all about.
Definitely. And I think, Andrew Webster is saying something like that in the chat. Relationship, all of this is relationships orientated, because, from having a selfish world to having a selfless world. I mean, that's ultimately we're born and we die, and there's a bit in the middle. So what is that bit in the middle going to be? And I know for a fact that as a parent, I've used very different styles with my children by virtue of my, circumstances. And I know that if you try the authoritarian, selfish motive, it doesn't work, because they will use a different language. They will go underground, so you've got to, so for example, you may be given hostility. Like, I thought my father was giving me hostility, calling my tea horrible. But, you've got to almost think, okay, I'm feeling it, but I'm going to offer respect. I'm going to offer the opposite. I'm not, so I was always brought up with this condition of, forgive first. Don't retaliate, forgive first. It was very hard. I'm not going to deny it. If somebody said something to me, I would swear, because I'm going to stand up for myself. And my mother would often say to me, no, you must, you must not retaliate. So we often see misbehaving celebrities, misbehaving politicians, we see misbehavior, and then all of a sudden it's like misbehavior is the right way. Well, actually, I don't think it is.
Well, this is about the language again. It comes back to the PowerPoint. It's the language of attention, isn't it?
Yes.
And again, this is maybe I see this in terms of, I can always seem get a bit of an edge at work if I use the phrase "going forward." My worst. I mean, I've said it. I tried it. I did try it. I've tried it a few times, and I felt dirty afterwards. I try not to. I experimented. I thought maybe this will be good for my career. I'll try to experiment and say "going forward." I thought, no, I feel.
But you know what? It starts with a relationship you have with yourself. It's like everything, isn't it? When you wake up in the morning, you're having a dialogue with yourself. In your dreams, in your nightmares, you are having a dialogue with yourself. As you approach any person, activity, yourself in the mirror, it shows up in your state. So you can see leaders that might be saying going forwards, but they're not owning that fact because they're feeling like they're hitting imposter syndrome. You see leaders try to say no to people and they can't because they're not embodying what no means. And so therefore, it's got to start with ourselves. It's got to start with our state. It comes right back to this early point of from the day that we are born, we need to find different ways to express ourselves, which is why it starts with art and then it starts with language. Then what we try to do is we try to silence children and train them to be compliant and say the right thing. Like Mandy's saying, my mum always taught me to treat negativity with a positive response. Well, that's great if that's serving you, but is it really serving you and the other person? Or are we just becoming really compliant? And therefore we're so compliant we become reactive rather than creative.
Arguably, it's not that somebody offers you a negative and you offer a positive. It's that level of understanding within yourself, and it's taken me a long, long time because I still haven't got there, is that two wrongs never make a right. It's that level of understanding. If somebody slaps me, I'm not going to slap them back. It's that retaliation. It's that, not to say you be subservient and get beaten, you be the victim. It's not that. It's that cognition within you to say, where am I going to get this equality if I don't actually openly accept equality?
But that language has
I just
driven all of
want
your
to
behavior,
take
isn't
on
it?
John on his statement on organizations before we go on in the conversation, because I have a little bit of beef with him, because he painted this rosy picture of the organizational future, right? I don't know if you noticed that, but he like did a little bit of a thing
If you
on us.
dream,
It's 'cause he's got a bigger mind.
you can.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
maybe.
It said something. This is like,
Yeah.
and I'm just wondering. Well, first of all, when I listened to you, I went like, "Wow, this is fantastic! Like, this is great news." It seems like organizations are moving into a direction which are appealing to us, right? So they start to recognize we have to bring in the whole. We have to look at this liminal space. We have to look at what people bring in as a human, right, as a self. And you go like, yeah, well, as somebody who's working in this area, go like, that's the way to go. But is that really happening? And well, maybe in some. Now he's saying no. He's like backpedaling a little bit.
They're saying it, but they're doing it in a logical. We must follow the steps and follow the process. So they're doing it in a logical way.
Someone told me to use the language, but we don't have the intention.
Yeah.
We don't have the
put something out there, which is what you can observe is a regulation never goes away, right? Mm-hmm. So once a regulation is set, doesn't matter if it's a governmental regulation or an organizational, how we organize ourselves is almost set in stone. And it'll take years for it to be, so it's easier to put more on top than to remove them, which would be needed to move forward in the direction which you're proposing and which I support, but which I...
I think it comes back to whether it's words or action, doesn't it? So we can, if you look at other species, if you look at elephants and how they communicate, if you look at trees and how they communicate, we're not the only people that can communicate. The difference with us is that our reach is different. So we can communicate through our bodies, we can communicate through love, we can communicate through our action. But the reality is a lot of the words that we use, which I think somebody said was about 7% of our influence, which I think is true, but I just want to double check it on the notes. I can't remember who said that. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll comments at the same time. But Alex
said 7% of communication is language, is words. That's what he said.
Yeah.
So and that was a good point. He said, "Why are we making such a fuss of language or of words if it's only 7% of all communication?"
So it does beg the question. Actually, what else are we saying in this conversation? But before we get too meta, this reminds me a little bit of Johnson and Scholl's cultural web. And somebody can kind of put it up, but it's like, it's the idea that language is reinforcing. We've got like symbols, power structures, organization, rituals, and probably something else. And one of the rituals on the show that I'm trying to establish is if anybody says the word liminal, I draw one of the bleak strategies. I'm going to actually, because I bought these, I need to get some value out of them. I'm going to actually draw you.
What are the semiotics of luminosity? That's my question.
Yeah, no. Luminosity doesn't actually get you a card, Brian, because we also need to think about continuity. So here we go. Short circuit.
It's the bridgeness of bridge. It's the quality of the bridge. Yeah. The luminosity.
Okay. So this is Luke. Luke, this is your oblique strategy card, Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. Short circuit example: a man eating peas with the idea that they will improve his virility shovels them straight into his lap.
That is a brilliant indication of language, though, isn't it? That's exactly language in a tin.
Yeah,
because people's interpretation, how they use it.
So it's Luke's card, Caroline, not yours. But you can have one, but you have to say liminal. Oh no, okay. I'm immune. So Luke, how do we short circuit this then? How do we shovel the peas
into our mouths? Not into our lap. Yeah, you gotta eat them.
I think if you knew anything about virility, what you do is shovel them into your wife's mouth so that she was therefore content and fed and feeling loved, and then you might have something to do with virility out of that.
There's equality for you. That's equality for you.
I think it's more. I think it's that and some. So yes, you might want to do things for someone else, but I think it's back to your point, Caroline, on self. It's a false question. You don't, to make it better, you don't shovel it into other. You don't do that. You figure out what you need for yourself, and then you look at your own mirror and you reflect back, and then do work with yourself first. I think that self thing is important, because I think the temptation is to do something to other people or rescue other people or just come back to yourself. But then actually, that doesn't fix anything. That's just looking at yourself.
Yeah. So to build on that, John, then you and Nims did a talk on transactional analysis, and there is a link here. The idea of short-circuiting, one way of short-circuiting is to look at our own needs and whether our needs are being met or not, and what needs am I trying to satisfy. So am I trying to, and often, in terms of do we need to get in touch with our own selves in order to be able to use language? It's often then comes down, I think, to, the short circuit, the shoveling the peas in the lap thing for me is actually being in touch with our needs when we're communicating, and then the needs of others.
Agree. Yeah. Again, it's that, getting to that level of, it's not even a level of maturity, because we do it from day one. As Caroline was saying, we self-regulate. And I think as we mix into the world, we forget to self-regulate, because the world is bombarding us with stuff. And it's like, oh my God, I better behave like this. I better do this and I better do that, because we forget to self-regulate, because we get so mixed up in actually this culture thing. Cultural web, somebody's saying on the web chat there.
I don't do you think, Mandy, you get, I want to go back to Mandy. You mentioned from selfish to selfless.
Yes.
And I don't know what it's, I think if you're selfless, you don't exist.
It's
Why
a really,
do you think that? Why? Where does that come from, Brian?
Well, if you've had children, if you're selfless, then what are you in the world with?
Can you not be in the world on your own? Are you not valuable if you're on your own?
No, I'm selfless. For me, when you know yourself, you understand what you're here to do. You understand your purpose. You understand your social service. If you're a servant of a certain type, your self indicates, by the way, the clutter goes away. The cultural clutter, all the information that clutters other people's minds, most of it disappears when you really know why you're here, right?
Agreed,
but you're only here because you have innate disposition. Some people are highly empathetic. They spend 20 years of their lives learning how to screen out data they feel, right? Because they're incredibly empathetic by nature, right? Empathy is part genetic, part learned. But selflessness, I like self-full, because self-full is not selfish. It's full of service. We serve with a self-full.
I like that.
I like that.
Yes,
I like that. I'm going to let you have it.
Okay,
Oh,
so I'm going to say one. The Scrum Guide came out yesterday, and they've removed servant leadership. Servant leadership has been removed from the Scrum Guide.
Good.
Yes, yeah. So, and everyone says yes, which is interesting. Let's explore that one. But yeah, I think you can be selfless, but I think you need to know your own boundaries on that one as well. You can't just it's yes and, but yeah.
I think, when I say selfless, coming back to the selfless bit is about, for example, I know that I'm going to take a selfless view when I'm going to go out running, because I'm not going to run that 10 miles as fast as, say, my counterpart. I know that it's about self-regulation. So selfless is not about, if I'm going to be selfish, I'll probably end up destroying myself. So it's probably a little bit in between, like what Brian, you're saying, it's self-full.
Only in the sense of.
I'll offer a slightly different angle on this discussion, which you can talk about. One of the things I'm interested in the shift from ego to eco. So you could say the small self is the kind of navigation system, the autopilot that preserves and keeps you safe. And it's the stories that your family tells you, that your culture tells you, and it kind of drives your identity. And that is a kind of a constructed self. But I think selflessness that Mandy's referring to is this larger essence, this larger self, which is sort of like the common self that we all hold together, within which we're nodes on a web of human connection. And it's actually my experience of that. When you experience that experientially, you actually start to be able to define yourself in a much larger way, and a much more autonomous way, much more free of the language and structures that have conditioned you. So that's, and in a way, I think this is what Brian's talking to in terms of this kind of revolution. We need enough people that are operating at that together. We need, it looks like, you know, it's kind of supreme autonomy, but it's actually grounded in a kind of common communion, in our common ancestry, our common humanity, and the fact that we're products of evolution. So,
the concept of a human ecosystem is
clarify that distinction.
The human ecosystem is going to be something we're hearing a lot more of in terms of synergistic connectivity.
So, in terms of language, and then, you know, that's right. I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, there's lots of terms I've learned that in the last couple of years, particularly, largely through some of you on LinkedIn and other people, you know, which is interesting. Andrew Webster's, you know, mentioning, you know, theory U. But I mean, even things like, say, psychological safety. I'd never heard the term psychological safety 2 years ago. Never heard it. Probably because I never experienced it. But
well, ironically, your guildcraft creates that exact state.
Yeah. Well, now I know how to create it. We've got a word for it that people have already provided that I can use. But that's a very interesting thing, because then it kind of goes into another word that's new to me, which is hypocognition. And I think I'm right in saying, I'm fairly new to it, I think I used it in your Brian Nuggets article. Hypocognition is not having the words to describe something, and therefore I have another cognitive deficit because I can't create a, language, sign, body movement. I can't say something that stands for something. I can't represent it, so I'm not able to then think about it and talk about it, communicate about it.
So what does that mean then for people that fall in love with somebody that can't speak their language? There are lots of, I mean, Sean Connery, really famous for that, actually had, when he met his wife, she couldn't speak his language, he couldn't speak hers, and they fell in love and they had a relationship. They didn't need words to express what they felt. And one might argue in most relationships it would probably lasted its length because of that. But but
they were probably really both good in sack, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. And when we talk about back to the hierarchy of needs, if self-actualization for me is all in the sack, then the reality is, why do we need all of this noise around it? Why do we need to be in this place where everything is replaced by words? And I fall foul to this because I've got instant messenger. I'm a bitch on instant messenger. And the reason for that is because my words can download in a moment, and they're there and they're gone. My frustration can rise in a moment and it's there and it's gone. But who I am in that space is not who I am if I'm in a different situation that's maybe physical, where I can touch and feel and sense somebody else. It's
a really lovely quote here by Richard Jeffries, just on what you were saying, Caroline. Oddly enough, the hours when the mind is absorbed by beauty are the only hours we live.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. And that's not found in your iPhone 11, is it? Let's face it.
No. Yeah.
No.
Okay, so I'm going to play again.
It's coming in the iPhone 12, though, I've heard.
I got to throw another spanner into the machine right now. Valerie in the chat writes, we need diversity so that our language and ideas of self do not become too homogenized. Okay, and there's something very paradox about that. Okay, now we sit here together, we're strewn across several continents, and we seem to be able to talk to each other, which is strange, to be honest. Like, we have some sort of common understanding how we as a group communicate, right? So that is based on our language and understanding.
Like we've done it before, isn't it?
And there's something very positive that we can do that now across continents and countries and cultures, and all that's all driven by language and understanding. But the other part is that these are all webs of meaning, and I think the title is even words weave worlds, right? So the language creates these webs of meaning for these communities, but what we also can see is that some people just don't agree, and they're outside of these webs. And the question is, are we still in the space where we can allow for these dissenters and outsiders to have their own webs, their own universes and all that, or do we expect now that all across these worlds and continents and culture, we have one language, one understanding of reality, one understanding of cognition, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's a huge problem that we don't accept this diversity anymore, that we say they're just people outside of our language, outside of our cognitive space, and have a completely different view on psychology, society, cognition, language, and they completely disagree with what we're talking about right now. I don't know. I perceive this to be a problem. Yeah.
I wonder
Luke,
because
I don't see the disagreement, Luke. I mean, I love the fact the Eskimos have 10 or 12 different words for white. I want to know about that. I mean, I expand my knowledge by being part of other diverse cultures. I'm not sure what we're saying disallows for the connectivity across the globe. It's just going to be a patchwork. It's not going to be, the world isn't a big hologram. It's more like a patchwork of holograms that do connect. This is like a patchwork.
I remember being criticised as a parent when my son was maybe 5 or 6 and he saw a white dog and he wrote down in his school book that he'd seen a milky dog. And the reason he'd called it a milky dog was because it was white and it looked like milk. And the teacher pulled me aside and said, you need to get him to start using the right descriptions for things. And I'm like, well, hold on, what's wrong with that? It's a white dog, it's not a milky dog. But if he was an Eskimo, I guess it'd be fine. But yeah, it's interesting.
So we've got this pressure around standardization of language, haven't we? That we need to be able to resist.
Yeah.
I wonder if
meaning, standardization of meaning.
Yeah.
That's much more. Yeah.
I wonder if there is a risk of homogeneity, if that's the right way to say it. Across, because of the success of the kind of Western model of business, because countries that were considered developing are now taking it up and are successfully copying and replicating and expanding their own economic models based on ours. Then that creates you could say the most common language across the world is this corporate language of strategy, globalization, digitalization. You could say in some ways that is a common language. This is why we've got globalization, and the world is getting smaller and smaller because of technology and communication. But at the same time, is that actually over suppressing the actual natural diversity? So there's a kind of there may be economic benefits, but like how many disappearing nations, how many cultures are being squashed under that success. And so actually I believe our own ability to access diversity is somehow interdependent with the degree of diversity that's on the planet. So the less diverse it becomes, then our own access to it diminishes.
And I think one of the things with, I suppose, is the universal language, skew quantity and price.
Yeah.
In effect, it goes back to, the David Ronsfeld TIMN, the idea of, tribes, institutions, markets, networks, that actually a lot of the language that is very dominant is around the market, this thing on Amazon and how much it costs and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I think distributed ledgers, right? The whole world of that's emerging is not just about Bitcoin. It's going to be about everything. And that's going to be an unfolding language that's going to change the way we think. But the beauty about distributed ledgers is that they're more human than we are. And I think the unfolding of that whole world, that unfolding of the Bitcoin world, it started there. It's going to affect politics. It's going to affect voting. It's going to affect self, because the future of our language is going to embrace this new way of thinking about transactions and transparency and connectivity.
And that's actually bringing in, Brian, isn't it? The Bitcoin and blockchain. It's bringing in provenance to language.
Yes.
It's not saying it's that my view is this. It's saying this is then linked to that, is linked to something else. So it's actually, to some extent, that is similar to a story, isn't it? In the sense, there's a narrative element to blockchain, we're actually building on something. It's almost like a co-creation of some type of story or a narrative.
Yeah, and we're in our infancy, just like social media really is in its infancy. I mean, if you look at it, it's the way people connect there. It's still very fragmented. Most people's biographies on LinkedIn are really not that representative of their true self. I remember our first meeting when we had I set up a prep meeting. I asked a very simple question. I said, let's share something about ourselves that we're not going to share in the talk that's authentically us. Like, do you like to cook? Do you like to something like? And no one. It was only two people that could actually talk about that. They can actually explain what's below the surface versus the tip of the language pyramid of themselves. And what was amazing is when you share those things that are more authentically you, that normally don't occur in the discourse of a conversation like this. For instance, I never follow recipes. That's really me. I look at a recipe and I love to cook, but I create my own thing every single time. That is a true indication of who and what and why I am. I'm a creative nut. I'm experimenting constantly. And so for me, back to the Bitcoin world, that's something that's coming into our language that we can't even anticipate. And that's kind of magical and scary.
So Val Freitas makes a point about diversity, also including neurodiversity. This is actually something that we're actively talking about in my organization at the moment. And one of the interesting things there is what we're finding is that it seems to be, if we consider it a bit more widely, it seems much more common. And it almost seems like we've actually, we started, a little session on this on a weekly basis. And what we're finding is actually, it's almost like loads of people, more people than we would expect. And it's almost like everybody's been pretending they're not neurodiverse. And then suddenly, oh my word, you as well. And it's like, so I'm expecting in 6 weeks' time probably to have like hundreds of people in this session. And it's like we're realizing we're all pretending, right, that we're not a little quirky and different. And actually those quirks and differences are, that's what makes us unique.
Well, that's the point. I think neurodiversity, Christopher, you're finding the waveform that occurred, that cresting wave of 100 people showing up, for me is an indication that people really want to represent themselves uniquely in the world. And that is, the neurodiversity is creating that space for that to be said.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Then now we have the word, Brian, along with uniqueness and neurodiversity and things like that. Now we have the words, we're able to talk about it.
Yeah.
But also we have the applaud, don't we? So organizations like Google are directly looking for people that have neurodivergent
but that focuses on Asperger. And it's focusing on things like Asperger's syndrome. They've been doing that for about a decade, along with Microsoft and others. I think we're speaking to a more scalar subtlety of the fact that everyone is neurodiverse. And you're going to hear that everyone's
all on a sliding scale. So we're all on a scale, aren't we, in terms of where we sit and what implications, what impacts it has on us. And we know that changes as our hormones change throughout our lifetime. So we also are learning much more about adult ADHD, as opposed to thinking it was just a really negative outcome for children that suffered, as we called it, for ADHD. And one of the reasons I was really interested in doing language around transformation is because I did some work with an organization where we segmented patients and how they communicated about their illness and their disease. And we found new ways, as most healthcare organizations that moving forward are, to empower people through language and to make sure that people actually were able to articulate their difficulties in a different way in order that they could better empower themselves in their own lives. And so you get that transformational effect of language when you use it appropriately. And I think what we're saying with the neurodiversity is that the more we embrace it, the more people are open to coming in and talking about it, which again creates a transformation. But you also see a fringe movement, I guess, of people that want to be able to relate and to connect to that, even though they may not have been diagnosed officially. with.
So there's some really interesting stuff going on in the chat, and rather than me dipping into it, I'd encourage everybody to have a little look and see if there's anything that crops up.
I really like what Valerie's saying, which is if language is used to participate and authenticate, how do we include those who do not have language?
I think because silence is a really powerful tool as well. And I think actually, it's a really unsung hero of language. I think the power of silence is a really interesting one.
You were
what does she mean by
your,
don't have? What does she mean by don't have language?
It could be somebody who is can't speak, or so it could be somebody that has something physical that means that they have problems communicating. It could also be people that don't have a voice, so it could be to do with lack of agency, which I see an awful lot of, and that's one of the areas I'm extremely interested in and actively involved in. It could also be to another of Val's point around nature. Nature, are we not better stewards of nature because nature can't speak for itself? I mean, nature is kind of speaking big time in different ways, but it's sort of true, is it? It's not actually sitting at the table negotiating with us.
But they negotiate with each other, don't they? So the study of trees really looks at how trees do communicate with each other and how that whole system works, and the power that it has against enemy, the power that it has in terms of making sure that the saplings get fed so that they can feed the trees. So they have signals, they have ways of communicating. Elephants can communicate for miles. They have succession planning going on. We're really not that different. To the animal species. We've just used different ways to manipulate it within our power, which is our power and control.
I have a real problem. I'm sorry, guys. It's not an issue that relates to anything but nature and man and women and humanity. I look at a dog, and a dog basically has, or a tree, or a fungus, or a ivy patch, or my backyard. Right? I live in nature because I really resonate to it. But nature has a very simple circuit. I mean, if there's no shade, I go here. If there's a lack of water, I adapt. I mean, we have these frontal lobes, and that really, it kind of provides a whole different complexity. So I would love to be a lion. I know exactly who I was. I'm a lion, right? Or I'm a skunk or whatever. Very simple genetic, zeros. I mean, not zeros and ones, but decision making is just lacks the complexity we have to deal with. I mean, I would love to be a tree. I mean, if you put me as a tree and there's light and there's soil and water, I'm a happy camper. I get to extend my roots and connect to other trees. I get to kill a few trees if I have acidic roots and I'm a black oak. I mean, it's just so simple. And we look at nature saying, oh, we should be more like nature. And I'm going, yeah, but we got frontal lobes. We got a problem.
So does that mean then that part of the problem here is we're looking in the wrong place? We're mistaking people talking for language.
Yes.
When actually we're actually immersed in language all the time, and we're just paying attention to the people who are jabbering.
It's why people say keep it simple, isn't it? Because so many people are making noise. There's so much noise in our world, and we're creating noise all the time. There's a lot to be gained from simplicity.
But the simplicity.
Michael says we're certain a tree does not wish to be a human. That's so funny. Absolutely, Michael.
The simplicity is complex as well, though. So it's everything's back to front. The simplicity is complex. So the simplicity you described, Brian, is evolutionary, and it's slow, and it's built on top of other things, and it's not in a straight line. It's sort of it's from the heart. It's from deeper down. But the complexity, the logical is simple. But it's like a computer. We're following steps, but we're thinking it through logically. So there's an interesting sort of back to front to it. So it's more than just it's more than you can't. I think we're missing that. We're missing the simplicity, but it's not simple. It's complex. And we're getting the simple confused with the complex. We're getting the two muddled up. And it's our logical brain that's doing that. It's ignoring our innate humanity.
And it's because we want to sit in our comfort zone, isn't it? Everybody that I hear that says don't overthink it, keep it simple, is because they want to sit within their comfort zone. They don't want to take on new thinking. And it takes time, doesn't it, to communicate effectively new thinking as it comes through. And people don't want to hear it because they want to stay in that comfort zone that we're in. We don't necessarily move forward.
I do agree that everything is becoming more complex, and we're recognizing more of our individual complexity of what makes up a human and what makes up life, and then how complex systems are and how they're interacting. But I found Caroline mentioned earlier silence, and I found actually silence and stillness is the way to access a sort of simplicity. And it's a kind of simplicity that cuts through all the other stuff. And it's a simplicity that connects you to your senses, to my senses. And the senses in some extremely complex processes that actually it actually helps you appreciate the simple things in life more, helps you appreciate breath, helps you appreciate taste, helps you appreciate listening. And I found that enables me to focus more on beauty, like was said earlier. That's the moment you're really living. And Mandy wants to speak.
Just on that note, Dave, of simplicity, when my daughter was younger, as a baby, she developed a tiny bit of eczema on her face here. And, as a mother, as a parent, you worry because you worry about your child's skin, etc. And circumstances led to the whole situation being understood, that her eczema used to get worse by virtue of her environment. And I was talking to her about this just the other day, and she's grown up now. I said, oh, you used to be a bag lady when you were younger. We used to call you a bag lady. And she said, well, what do you mean? She said, I remember having my teddy bear in one of the bags and I couldn't find it. And then somebody had put it in my lunchbox. And I said, no, you used to want all your bags with you, all your belongings, because she used to feel that there was uncertainty in the home. And it stems back to that simplicity. It stems back to that understanding. And if you don't, then the body itself will manifest it. And she, the lovely little soul she was, she used to, it would come out as eczema. I'm going to have to go because I'm out of a tutor.
What?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mandy.
Bye.
I want to build on what Dave said. Dave, I took a breath while you were talking.
Oh,
okay.
Nice.
I took 3. I was conscious of that. There's 2 people I've met in my life that do something that's very peculiar. One was a psychiatrist in Palo Alto who, when you said something and it resonated, right? There was resonance to him. He would go, out loud. Okay. And now another gentleman in the London area, the North England, I think, Barry Holmes. Some of you may know Barry Holmes. Beautiful, beautiful gentleman, doing great work with other people. He would literally pause if you said something that had meaning. I mean, a visceral resonant meaning. He would pause and go like this. And he'd stop. And I looked, I had to process this logically. I went, okay, he's doing that. And so I learned to pause with him because there was something that he said that resonated that I wanted to connect to. Yeah. But I couldn't connect to it logically. I had to shut it. I had to shut it down, and I had to feel whatever he was feeling. That was a series of words, right? It was a sentence or whatever. And he would literally go, and then the whole group of like 6 of us right now would all stop and reflect on what was just said to see if there was a deeper sense of meaning in that.
Some of my peak moments in groups is when that happens across the whole group. So there's a kind of degree of authenticity and embodiedness that it actually articulates a deeper truth about your own humanity. It stops everybody's mind activity. and you've dropped
Letting
somewhere
go. I
else.
call that. I refer to that as letting go.
Letting go. Yeah, yeah.
So are we talking about then we need to be, in terms of being more articulate and more fluent, we need to be more articulate and fluent in letting go, being silent, pausing. It's almost like
Feeling.
counterintuitive in a way.
And
Feeling.
we should also be more appreciative of people who are silent, and we aren't.
Yeah.
And that's it would again back to organizations or groups or teams and all that. There's always a couple of silent people there, and nobody ever asks them, "What do you think?" Because if you ask them, they have very interesting things to tell you, but they just don't. It all goes inside, and it's like in there's all this processing. It's very complex, very sophisticated, but they keep it for themselves.
Yeah,
and I think that's
normally right.
And maybe in terms of neurodiversity, I think that's important to observe, that you have sometimes these people who are able of these complex thoughts, but nobody asks them. They're just silent. They get drowned out by the noise, and that's the end of the story.
When you create really good organization dynamics, you completely change the team meeting structure. So the meeting structure should respond to all learning preferences and neurodiversity and everything else, but it completely alters the meeting structure, because what you end up doing then is then mopping up with the quiet people. So you better prepare them so that they can prepare, they can reflect, they can have something to say and bring to the meeting. You don't do it all in one big bang in the meeting. And then you also do a mop-up to say, well, actually, what were the ideas that came out after we'd digested that information properly? Whereas what we do in organisations is go, right, you've got an hour. In that hour, we're going to decide everyone's future, or we're going to decide the future goals of the organisation, or we're going to use the data that we've got. And most people in that meeting can't contribute or contribute in a good way, because they all think differently and they all operate and function differently. So your answer to your question about people that are quiet in meetings, it's really important that we change our approach to the way that we run organisations in order to embrace every soul that sits within it.
Yeah, I mean, I do this I'm a bit of a specialist in this area, so I wouldn't mind just talking to the point. And Val's made a point that, you know, we're obviously talking about all non-verbal language. When I did the guild stuff a couple of years ago, I realised, or in fact before that, I kind of realised actually it was the non-verbal that was really driving the outcome. And it wasn't the words, it was the other stuff. I'm a bit of a specialist in this. Oh, echo, not quite sure. But anyway, I work quite actively in that area, and what I've noticed is that when people speak, it's often because they have a need they need to fulfill. And when people are silent, it can be that they have a need to be silent, or it could be that they're waiting for everybody else to shut up. So, or it might be that they're not quite sure. So what I'm often doing in the guilds is I'm trying to play with that dynamic a little bit. So often there's quite a lot of awkward pauses in the guilds, particularly for the first one. And what's really interesting, and I can predict it every single time, the more awkwardness and pauses there are in a guild in the short term, the better it is in the long term. Because people grow into the space, and I can just see it. I've seen it again and again and again, and it's just
measure that and write that paper.
Oh yeah, I could measure it, no doubt about it. And what's happening is some people will then fess up that they feel pressure to contribute, and they'll apologise, and it's like, well, that's a result, and I don't even have to provoke this. It's almost people, you know, they kind of realise. And what I tend to do is I try and make it a little bit sloppy and leave gaps and like it's all a bit, and it's almost like the more gaps I leave and the more sloppy I am, the more it invites other people in.
Interesting.
My observation on this is it's about your own model and the models of others. If you acknowledge what you're seeing in the world isn't what everyone else is seeing, and you're just seeing a model of the world, and you meta out, and you then try and understand people's views from their points of view and their models, then you stand a chance of seeing what's really happening in the room. But so it's about kind of, yeah, and people do have different needs, and it's about needs, your needs and their needs. But as a facilitator, you need to kind of, I just remind myself that I'm not seeing the world, and the world I'm seeing is not the world. It's my version of the world. It's my model of the world, and my model of the world is similar to everyone else's model of the world in these 6 little boxes. Our models are very, very similar, but we are biased. We have our own bias. We see the world in a similar way. And many people in the world see the world in a complete different way through a different model. Our model of the world is a world where we think there should be diversity and all of the things we've been talking about. That is not the case of everyone. And so I remind myself that is not the case. But I think true diversity is being open to all models, and even models that I disagree with completely. And I'm just going to hook a little bit off that little talk I did with Nims earlier. Byrne talks about human hungers. And the hungers are what people need, and you either need more or less of them, and we all need more or less of different things, but we're kind of drawn to different things. We're drawn to needing more recognition or less recognition. We're drawn to more stimulation or less stimulation, or we're drawn to more structure or less structure. And it's finding what individuals need and finding out what kind of model they have, and then sort of letting them be in their model and see the world. So I know I've gone a bit meta here, but it's it's.
But I also think it's also got to be about social learning, hasn't it, John? So who we are within this group of 6 people is really learnt in terms of how we need to be, what works for the show, what that looks like, what we need to be expressing. So I'm sure all 6 of us have different views that we could express in a different dynamic with a different group that's not necessarily represented here. Because as a good example, my university professor for when I studied English said, "What I will tell you today, I never want to hear repeated again. So don't ever let me hear John said this, and so then John thinks that," because the reality is every day is different. And what I'm articulating to you today is either built by construct, I'm either paid to say it or I think it. But tomorrow I might be paid to say something different, I might construct it differently, and I might think differently because you've influenced my thinking around that. And so what you find is in small groups like this, it's really quick to adapt, to socially learn, to understand how to become one. And Luke often says we don't challenge each other enough. And it doesn't, because we become very uniform to each other's thinking very quickly.
I just want to go back to what you said, Chris. Just on also John. I think what you said in terms of that we have these models of the world, and we just use language a lot just to explain these models, right, to each other all the time, just like we're doing now on this show, right? And then we try to figure out, well, where do they overlap, and do we really talk about the same stuff or not? And yeah, we agree, we don't agree, and all that. And I'm just wondering about what you said, Chris. These awkward pauses. Is that something where this process gets disrupted slightly so that there's more chance of something new arising from that group, whereas now we're just politely exchanging our mental models with each other like polite people we are, and in the end we're not really growing something out of that group? And so I'm very interested in that method which you're using. Is that something one could actually instill in a group to say, I'm looking for those pauses, I'd like to provoke them?
Yeah, exactly. So Luke, this actually to some extent then goes back to Brian and this idea of the human singularity, because what I'm doing in the back of my mind, being a kind of diverse thinker, I'm almost trying to say, how can I stand up? How can we be more like a hive of bees? And it's like, and I always fail at it, but sometimes I get a little glimpse of, we're a bit more bee-like or a bit like ants-like today. It's basically, that's what I'm trying to get at. So it's this kind of group consciousness. I always fail, but sometimes I just get a little chink of saying, oh, that was a bit like it. And that's kind of exciting to me. That's the buzz. That's the buzz. Yeah.
Chris, I wonder, John was giving this example of the over-rationalized way of acting in organizations. And I wonder if the kind of fuzzy approach, the non-regulative approach, the non-scheduled, the non-strategized, that is what potentially gives people permission to open up.
Yeah.
Because it actually is so different to normal organizational life that you can actually relax and be yourself more than you can anywhere else.
Yeah, and it's about Amaranato, Roby, and the idea of, playful monkey. It's about play. It's actually going back to being the preschooler again. So we've got these innately. We haven't lost them. It's just they're dormant.
It's the Joker. It's
actually, so.
It's the Joker.
Oh, I think you know Amma, don't you?
Yeah, I know Amma. Yeah.
It's the Joker. It's the court jester, and the importance of that court jester in transformation. The court jester in ancient times could talk to the king, could tell the king the things that need to be said, and they didn't get with being out of the court. So that role of the jester in the role of transformation is very important in my mind. You have to take that slight jest, not too far, slight jester for the sense. You wear very bright shirt. That's an intentional thing you're doing. I take my shoes off on premise. I walk around with no shoes on a little bit. I do things that are slightly off kilter because it's slightly off kilter, and that opens up that people can say what they really want to say.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant kind of plug for next week's show, which is about archetypes. But you're about 5 minutes too early, John. But not bad.
Not bad.
So there's still hope for language and transformation, because that was, I think Caroline touched upon that, and I was wondering, after all this talk now, is there really hope that language can provide us with transformation? There seems to be a little bit of hope now that as long as it's slightly off kilter, it's not you can't really immediately put it into a box. It has something wild to it. Then language can help somehow in transformation, or can it?
Well, isn't every
I'm keen. Sorry, Brian, I'll be quick. I'm keen to hear. We're moving into unprecedented times, and we need unprecedented language. So we need to form new languages and ways of communicating in the world because of the challenges we're facing, and we're in transition. So that's shaking things up. So that is where the promise and potential is, that we can find a language that we can navigate where we need to go together.
Yeah.
And Luke, I think our mental models change every time we have an insight.
Oh, yeah. And for that, we need the letting go. We need the pauses, don't we, Brian?
Yeah.
We need some irritation, also some provocation, some paradoxes and stuff like that. Otherwise, we just sit in them and feel comfortable. We just say, well, it works for me, so I'll listen to yours, but mine's fine.
So is that another problem that actually we need there to be ambiguity needs to be there. If you think about language, people talk about VUCA, and oh my word, it's VUCA. What was it? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Actually, those are the recipes of a good dinner party, aren't they?
If you have the courage to bring them in, if you have courage,
we need in communications too much certainty and let's
be clear. Okay, so before we get too humorous about that, the reality is with transformation is we don't know where we're going, and it is a death of the past and it's in something new. And most people really do need grounding in that situation. They need really clear communication. They need that communication to be verbal and non-verbal. They need it to be shown up in action. They need it to be there in order that they feel psychologically safe to talk about where their concerns are. But they do need structure in that ambiguity. So whilst transformation is ambiguous, the language that we use around it to get us to the other side has to be really well considered, and quite often it's not. Quite often it's just a corporate commons that goes out. But actually, and it's the same lesson that I learned in healthcare, is that you have to find a way to empower people through language rather than disempower. You have to find a way to give freedom to people through language as opposed to constrain people through language. That language has to start from the minute they wake up to the minute they go to bed, and organizations have a role to play in that, in terms of happiness, in terms of autonomy, in terms of being authentic and helping people through what is a journey. And to Dave's point right now, that journey is unknown, not just at grassroots, but it's actually unknown at board level. And a lot of the data that we've relied on before to give us good decision making is no longer there. And so then again, that kind of how we create this new language and this new information, these new data points to help us into the new world is, as Dave's already said, it's a transition.
And this also goes to the point around purpose and identity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, that actually we need, corporations need a purpose and identity in the same way, you know, Brian, we need to understand what our unique gifts are in order to live an authentic life. And actually that's where we need the clarity. I guess it is actually understanding exactly what are we about, and then everything else might be up in the air. But, you know, if we can, you know, I mean, I love Microsoft here, you know, they talk about, you know, they want to allow everybody in the world to achieve more. You know, they know what they're about.
So,
you know, the thing about uniqueness is that it's the scariest path, the scariest journey any individual can travel. Because imagine you look in the mirror and you decide, I'm going to take my whole self on so I can live with purpose. I can have synergy in my relationships. I can make good stuff happen that I'm born to make happen. But it's the scariest thing in the world for a person to try to embrace their self. Because imagine if you fail at that.
So Val's given us an exam question here.
Thank you,
I should
Val.
focus on somebody else, but yeah. So, but it's quite a relevant one. So for because it brings us back to the exam question with 5 minutes to go. So for transformation, how can language be used to reduce fear and provide a feeling of safety? John.
So Caroline made a clear point about clear language, and fear is a virus. It's in clear language, and it's people, and it spreads, and fear spreads, the language spreads. Clarity reduces, you need safety, but you need clarity. You need to be really clear and short. But someone made a comment earlier about the silence. It's almost that transformation needs the silence. So we need to let go of the language. We need clarity of language, and then we need to let go and then let it happen. And then we're clear again. So it's the opposite. And I think that comes back a bit to my point earlier, where I think it's about the embodiment as well. When we're letting go of language, we're not talking, we're not using the front of our brain, we're going back to our metaphors, we're going down our brainstem, and we're really feeling it, or we're feeling it more deeply. And then we're connected, then we're whole, we're the ride on the horse again, and then we can move forwards, then we can step forwards. So I think it's complex, and it's the opposite of what typically people in organizations do. They they don't do that, and I'm doing it now, talking now. But yeah, that's my slight epiphany. It's being quiet, so I should really shut up and start speaking at some point. What do you think, guys? Yeah,
I think Luke would make. It's funny. I was observing Luke being quiet earlier, and I was waiting for him to bring up that point about, you know, sometimes quiet is the best place.
You caught me.
Luke just says, I don't know what you're talking about. Luke's command sign, who? What?
What's going on?
What? Who are you?
Those are the best moments. Yeah, that's where I prefer
Luke,
being there. By the way,
Luke, you were screaming in your silence.
Yeah, always. There's like finally somebody who sees it. Yeah, great.
So
this was worth it already.
Yeah. So what we could do with a couple of minutes left, we could do we could just do a quick summing up. You know, just very short of like sort of go round. So John, do you want to give us, you know, what are your closing thoughts? Do you think we've answered the questions? Have we opened up more avenues than we've answered, or how would you?
I've enjoyed the conversation. I've enjoyed chatting to you folks. It's been lots of fun. Thank you. I think I just gave a summary, and I'm joking around a little bit, but yeah, I think in summary, it is the balance. It's your own model. It's seeing yourself. It's using things like clean language, as Valerie and Andrew were just saying, and it's being able to sort of see each other for who they are and accept everyone for who they are, but also acknowledge that that's my view, and my view is not the same as other people's view. And I also need to accept people if they don't think that other people should be accepted for who they are. And that's that's the next
weird,
stage.
isn't it? Yeah.
It is weird and it's really difficult, but that's really important.
Dave.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the back and forth, and lots of contributions have really struck me. I haven't been able to respond to everything that I've perceived, but I think what I'm left with as a result of the call is this need for a sort of the whole body as an organ of sense perception from which language, new language, or the language we need can emerge. So the language is sort of the social body of the human body, and using that, not just the brain and the prefrontal cortex, but the kind of tapping into the wisdom of the body, and that opening up new organs of sense perception.
Yeah, thank you.
Luke, go ahead. Go ahead, Luke.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I want Chris to do a show about silence. That's what I want to happen.
It's the week after next. We're already.
Right.
It's already
there.
Emma's going to come on. Yeah, and
great. So that's all. That's all I have to say, because I think that I come to this conclusion after all this talking. That's where where the good stuff is.
That's where you can contribute.
After all the language.
Yeah, it's going to be our.
And thanks for Brian for bringing that up. So thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's going to be our John Cage 4 minutes 33 seconds episode. We might talk about silence as well, if that's allowed. Caroline.
I think it was an interesting journey between where we've been with language and where we're going to, and what those implications might look like, and some of the constraints and restrictions. I think it was good to talk about how we embody language and how we use it to control and to influence, and how it has power, and to look at that in the arts as well as within corporate organisations. Did we answer the exam question? The exam question, as ever, is too big. So next year we'll get into more detail as we get into, smaller shows. But I think definitely it's a good starting point for conversation.
And then Brian, do you want to have the final word on this?
I've got nothing to say. I have nothing to say. I want to thank everyone that's in the chat space. I really would like to see the chat space brought forward more in the future.
Yeah.
And I want to thank Christopher for the incredible amount of effort that you're doing to make all this happen.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's fun. I mean, the deal is the more fun you have, the less work it is for me. So there's the clue. But yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed it too. So I think we're out of time now. So I'd like to thank John, Dave, Brian, Luke, Caroline, and Mandy, who had to leave a bit early. Thank you to StreamYard for an excellent platform, and mostly for the people that I largely ignored on the chat who were watching, and we really appreciate it. And I do actually go through this stuff afterwards, and I think, oh shit, that looks better than the show. So yeah, good job.
Outrageous language to use.
So I'm only joking. The show's brilliant as well. But so thank you very much. Next week we're going to talk the archetypes of transformation, and so we can get somebody from Australia. It's actually going to be at a later date. It's going to start at a later time. It's going to start at 7 till 8:30 next week. So that's good. So look out. I'll post in fact, I'm a little bit. I didn't go to the meetup. Normally I post the link, but what I'll do is I'll post like the link to our meetup, where there's the details for next week's show. So all it's left to do for me is say that I've been your host, Chris Patton, and yeah.